Irashaimase. Hello and welcome to Fataris' Kitchen. I'm your host, Chef Fataris. It's time once again for Shoot 'em Up Saturday, and on the menu this week we have Touhou fan-made virtual autography, a unique take on bullet hells. What kind of taste will it have? Let's get cooking and find out. From developer Northern Mind, Touhou fan-made virtual autography released for PC in March of 21. Now in January of 23, it's available for the Nintendo Switch courtesy of publisher Mediascape. This title is a fan production based off of the Touhou Project series, and it brings some interesting ideas to the formula that you find in Touhou games. And as far as those unique formulas and takes are concerned, they're a little bit hard to describe, so let's dive into the game itself and I'll kind of show you as we go along. So the main menu, we have the ability to just straight up start the game. There's a party edit, which I'll explain in just a bit. You also have a handy manual which can explain some of the finer points of the mechanics, a really nice library, and of course your replay. Starting the game, we're taken to our difficulty selection. To better show off the game, we'll go with easy today. But playing it on normal felt really appropriate as well, and then you've got your harder difficulties. We have 3 characters once you select your difficulty selection, and their characters, 2 of them are main characters in the Touhou project, and then the third one is one that's a little more of a minor character, but she just still does have roles throughout the whole series of Touhou. We have Reimu, who's your main shrine maiden from Touhou. Marisa, the mage. And then we have Sumireko. Each character has a different kind of shot, focus shot, and bomb. So that's a key thing to keep in mind. Basically, we've got our straight shot, we've got our trailing option lasers, and we have our homing shots. So for our purposes today, we'll be showing it off the game with Reimu, but I do think that the 3 characters have unique enough gameplay that it's really nice having all 3 so you can better explore the game. Starting, or rather, selecting your character, we're taken to the last part of your player select, and that's your party selection. So this is what this fan-made virtual autography brings to bullet hells. It gives this kind of almost mobile JRPG element where you're collecting these fairies that are either in colors white or red, and combining them into parties. And what do these parties do? We'll get to that in just a bit, but one thing to note is you've got stats and abilities you get from these particular fairies. So party 1 here is kind of my example of a weak party. You see you've got a whole bunch of 1 and 2 star fairies, and then based off of the combined stats of these fairies, we have a certain amount of HP, red attack, white attack, and healing, and then the abilities they confer upon us. So smaller player hitbox, larger item collection radius, and unit attack power up. So this party 2 has usually been my default go-to, as it's a much stronger party, and for most of the game that's kind of what you want. If you're playing really well, a weak party will totally get you through, but if you're having difficulty, you want to kind of assemble the party that best fits both your playstyle and also has decent power. Selecting our... Well, before we dive into the game, it is possible to edit this based off the fairies you've selected. So, if you've played a fair bit of the game, there'll actually be quite a bit here, and these fairies represent areas in the world of Touhou, Gensokyo. And you can kind of see, over here on the right, there's their status, so that's all their stats, the abilities they confer to you, and above that you also have a source of what game they are kind of from and represent, if they have one. Overall, it's I wish there was a little bit more to them, and there's 1 or 2 that do have a bit of questionable iconography, but with all that said, it is an interesting mechanic. I do have some problems with it though. So depending if you've replayed some stages, you'll have tons of them, but past a certain point, if having more than 4 copies of them doesn't really do you much of any good. Anyway, backing out and selecting our party, we're taken to the stage select. There are a total of 6 stages throughout the course of the game, as well as another stage you can unlock as well. But we'll go with stage 1 to show off the game. So on the left we see our party of fairies, on the right we see the enemy. Before we get into that, let's just talk really quickly about our own abilities. We have a main shot, so this is Reimu's, and we have the ability for focus movement. For the switch, the focus movement is tied to any of your shoulder buttons. Pressing those, we get our focus shot. So the focus shot for Reimu just is this straight up, like, it just focuses her straight shot and also gives it just a little bit more power. We also have a bomb as well, but we need to charge that up. So how do we charge up our bomb? The same way we charge up the fairies that we have on the left. So as we defeat enemies, like, they'll drop one of 2 different colored items. They'll drop either white items if they're white enemies, or red items if they're red enemies. And those enemies will power up the fairies of the corresponding color. What does that power up do? It gives those fairies both an attack to use against the enemy fairy team on the right, as well as powering up our bombs as well. So what happens if we don't get enough attack power off of picking up these items that I was mentioning? So these are the items that the enemy drops. And if we don't have enough damage to defeat the enemy party in its entirety, the enemy party will deal damage back to us. And that ultimately will be hit our HP in the bottom left there. So I haven't been hit by the enemy at all at this point, but yet I've still lost HP because my party wasn't strong enough to take out the enemy party. That's one element I don't necessarily like about this particular system, as you can be performing really well, but if you've put together a bad team or just haven't focused on picking up the items, basically those cards that the enemies drop, you'll still lose life. Another way to gain power though is using the bombs, and this is the bomb that Reimu has. For Marisa, it's a really neat beam, and then Sumireko, since she's got these homing shots, her focus basically sends out the shadow of herself. When you use your bomb, you warp to that, and then her bomb kind of forms a force field around her. That one's actually pretty neat. Anyway, back to the gameplay. So at the end of either meter on the right of the screen, or if you defeat a boss, however many attacks your fairies have accumulated will fire at the enemy, and then they'll fire their attacks back at you. How does the enemy power up? If you take damage against the enemy, that's ultimately how the enemy powers up, and I'll show that off right now. So the various fairies we defeated, we do collect. So that's kind of the mobile game RPG element of it. But unlike mobile JRPGs, one thing that we can't do with these fairies that we're collecting, we can't power or level them up. So some of them I've got quite a few copies of, and at this point I'm earning even more, but ultimately they will always remain the same static power. So I did take a hit there, and as you can go and see, the enemies on the right are now displaying 2 hits of attack. If they power up significantly enough from me taking damage, then it's very likely that they'll knock us out the next time we have a party battle, which will be when that indicator on the right of the screen hits the top. Party battle, boom. We actually had enough power on our end to take out all the enemies, so we didn't actually take any damage. That is a neat element. So oftentimes you'll be facing sub-bosses, which are usually just the boss of the stage themselves making an early appearance, or in some cases it'll be a different character or a different boss altogether. And those are a great place to power up and use the items that you've collected. So I'm not 100% sure if that makes sense. Basically, the quick summary, you collect items to power up the attacks for your fairies. They go and fight the other fairies. If you don't have enough power to defeat those fairies, you take damage. And if you take enough damage, it's game over. And the enemy fairies power up from you taking hits. So you see, like when I got hit, there's a whole bunch of black items that fly out from me, and now the enemy has all these attacks. So as far as what I feel about this whole system, it's finicky. You could potentially have a situation where you've performed really well, but you take a couple hits and it's game over on that stage because your fairies were too weak to defeat the enemy on the regular. So there are situations where if your fairies aren't strong enough against the enemy team that you're facing, then you'll take damage even if you had a perfect run in a section of the stage. I don't think that's particularly a fair way to have it. And then you've got all these different fairies that you're collecting and powering up, and the game itself likens itself to kind of that mobile JRPG element. But the part that I kind of disagree with that comparison is in mobile JRPGs, especially when you have multiple copies of units, you can often power up those units, and that's just not possible here. It would be great if we could get like higher power levels for the fairies that we have, but when you're constructing a party, you're actually allowed to only have one fairy in your party of 4 or above rank. So like mostly your party will be made of weaker fairies. It doesn't seem like a very fun to give a player that kind of restriction and basically make it so that you're like can only hit a certain power threshold. It's kind of fun to sometimes be able to put together runs that are overpowered, and as far as the ability to create harder runs for yourself, if a player is like after that kind of challenge, they can do that themselves. So as far as the minus flavors are concerned, so the fact that the system is fairly static and just the fairies that we collect is disappointing. I feel like there's definitely some promise there, but without a little bit more flexibility and the ability to power up or level up your units, basically, it just feels like you're just going to go and find one setup that works for you, and that's 100% of the time what you're going to go with. Then another thing that I hadn't mentioned, because there's actually no score to speak of, is the lack of a scoring system. A lot of the elements that people love about good bullet hell is unique scoring systems and aiming for high scores. In this game, there's nothing like that, so really, like, once you've beat the game, it's kind of up to you to, like, if you want to challenge it on harder difficulties, or if you're dissatisfied with the gameplay you got out of it, as you're not going to be chasing any high scores in this title, like, whatsoever. But as far as the plus flavors are concerned, especially being a bullet hell and one that's a Touhou Project fan game, I definitely feel that this game does exceptionally well with the boss battles being interesting and fun, with some really like enjoyable bullet hell patterns to ultimately play around with and dodge. I really appreciate when we do have some strong boss design, and I feel like this game has that. And although I do have some complaints about the system, I do appreciate that they're trying something different with the whole bullet hell formula. I just feel like it just needed a little bit more tweaking, and then we would have had something a little bit more enjoyable. As is, this is something that I can only go and recommend for bullet hell fans or Touhou Project fans that might be looking for something a little bit different. And really, if you're enough of a Touhou fan, you've probably already played this with its Steam release a couple years ago. Alright, well, that'll just about wrap it up for this week's episode of Shoot 'em Up Saturday. As always, I want to thank you so much for joining me this week. I hope you yourself have a wonderful week, and I look forward to seeing you again next time.